The Last Witness. Seoul never stopped moving. The streets pulsed with neon signs, the sound of distant traffic layered over muffled voices, and the rhythmic chime of pedestrian signals. The city carried on, indifferent to the secrets buried beneath its surface. Kang Ji-ho stood at the edge of it all, watching from across the street as a familiar cafe glowed under its aging sign. Years had passed, but nothing had changed the same worn wooden tables, the same warm scent of roasted coffee drifting through the air. Yet, standing there now, he felt the weight of time pressing down on him. Inside, Jung Hae-won sat near the window, stirring her tea absent-mindedly. The cup in her hands was warm, but her fingertips remained cold. The documents in front of her thin, unimposing hand held more danger than their appearance suggested. When Ji-ho stepped inside, she acknowledged his presence only with the faintest glance before pushing the folder toward him. He took it without opening it. He already knew what it contained. The past had been carefully erased, files destroyed, witnesses silenced, trails covered, but some things refused to disappear completely. Hidden within old financial records and corporate ledgers was a story of power and corruption, a network of people who had controlled the city's fate for decades. It had taken Hae-won years to piece together even this much, working through threats, dead ends, and the quiet pressure of those who wanted her to stop. Ji-ho had walked away from this world once. He had chosen silence over a fight he could not win. But she had never stopped searching. Now, she had reached a point where turning back was no longer an option. The city outside the cafe remained unchanged, but everything between them had shifted. The weight of the folder in his hands was familiar. So was the certainty that, from this moment forward, there would be no escape. The office they arrived at was hidden behind a row of closed storefronts, its entrance marked only by an unlit sign and peeling paint. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cigarette smoke and damp paper. The man behind the desk barely acknowledged them as he slid another folder across the surface, his expression betraying nothing. Ji-ho flipped it open, scanning the contents. The information was worse than expected. The names that appeared across the pages were familiar politicians, corporate executives, and law enforcement officials. They were the ones who had shaped the city, their influence stretching into every aspect of life. Some had already disappeared, resigned quietly, moved overseas, or been erased before questions could be asked. Others remained in place, untouchable. The deeper they looked, the clearer the pattern became. People who had tried to expose the truth had vanished. Some had been discredited. Others had met sudden, quiet endings. There was no evidence left behind, only the knowledge that stepping too close to the truth was dangerous. Ji-ho closed the folder. The silence in the room stretched between them. The next step was clear, but taking it meant crossing a line they could not return from. The narrow streets of Seoul's older districts felt colder than usual. They moved with purpose, their pace careful but unhurried. It was a strange feeling knowing they were being watched but unable to see by whom. The last remaining lead was Choi Sang-min, a man who had once been part of the very system they were now fighting against. He had disappeared months ago, leaving behind only the faintest traces of his existence. But rumors suggested he had not gone far. Somewhere on the outskirts of the city, he was still waiting. Finding him required patience. Convincing him to talk required something more. When they finally reached him, it was clear he had not spent the past months in peace. His eyes carried the exhaustion of a man who had seen the consequences of stepping out of line. The lines on his face were deeper, his movements slower. He had barely survived his own betrayal. Yet, when Hae-won placed the documents in front of him, something changed. The hesitation in his hands, the way his gaze lingered on certain names he knew more than he was willing to admit. He had seen what they had done, and somewhere, hidden away, there was one final piece of evidence that could bring them down. A ledger. More than just names or whispers, it was proof. A record of every transaction, every bribe, every carefully orchestrated cover-up. It had been kept secret, passed between those who thought themselves above consequence. But it was no longer in their hands. And they were not the only ones looking for it. The storage facility was nearly abandoned. its metal shutters rusted along the edges, its outer walls covered in faded advertisements that had long since peeled away. The air smelled of damp concrete and old dust, the kind that settled in places people had long forgotten. But this place had not been forgotten entirely. Jiho and Haiwan moved cautiously through the rows of storage units, the echo of their footsteps lost in the vast emptiness of the space. Somewhere in here, the ledger was waiting. It had been hidden away, passed between hands that thought it safer in the dark than in the light. If they found it first, they would have the truth. If someone else got to it before them, they would have nothing. The door to one of the units stood slightly ajar. The lock had been broken. The latch was forced open. Inside, metal shelves lined the walls, filled with old boxes and scattered papers. Jiho sifted through them quickly, flipping through documents that bore corporate stamps, legal contracts, and financial reports. But the ledger wasn't there. A quiet but unmistakable noise. A shift in the air, the kind that only came when someone else was near. Before Jiho could react, the first blow struck his side. He barely had time to turn before another figure lunged from the shadows, the dim light catching the glint of a weapon. Instinct took over. His arm moved to block, his stance shifted, and his muscles braced for the impact. He struck back, fast and controlled, forcing distance between them. Haiwan had moved too, using the shelves to her advantage. One attacker stumbled back, caught off guard by her quick movements. But there were too many. A fight that had started in silence now filled the space with the sound of fists meeting bone, bodies crashing into metal, and the sharp gasps of breath between strikes. Jiho could feel the weight of the fight pressing down on them. They were outnumbered. They needed to get out. Then gunfire. The sharp crack of a bullet against steel. The fighting stopped. A new presence stepped into the dim light, his figure framed by the open doorway. Jiho didn't need to turn to know who it was. The steady click of expensive shoes against concrete, the weight of a gaze that had no need for urgency. Chairman Zhang. He had been waiting for this moment. Jiho exhaled slowly, the tension in his muscles shifting from fight to calculation. They had walked straight into his hands. Zhang did not need to raise his voice to command attention. His power was in the certainty of his control. He had built his empire on silence, on the knowledge that no one could touch him. The people who had tried before were gone, erased, forgotten. And yet Haiwan still stood, Jiho still stood, and in her hands, barely visible against the dim light, was a worn, leather-bound book. The ledger. Zhang's confidence did not falter, not yet. He was still the one holding all the cards. The difference was that, for the first time, he did not hold all of them. The distant wail of sirens began to break the silence. A sound that did not belong in this world of secrets. A sound that did not usually come in time. But this time, it had. Zhang's expression shifted. A fraction, a flicker of something beneath the surface. He had not expected this. The fight had already been decided. Jiho's breaths were slow and controlled as the weight of the moment settled in. Haiwan's grip on the ledger remained firm. The truth had finally been pulled from the dark, and for the first time the shadows did not seem so endless. The police station hummed with a quiet tension. Officers moved in and out, their conversations low, their glances lingering just a second too long. Outside, news vans had already begun gathering, waiting for a statement, for an answer to why Chairman Zhang, one of the most powerful figures in the city, had been brought in for questioning. Haiwan sat at the interrogation room's metal table, her fingers resting against the worn leather cover of the ledger. The weight of it was real, solid, undeniable proof of what had always been whispered about but never confirmed. Jiho stood near the door, his arms crossed, his gaze steady. The night had been long, but the real fight was just beginning. The detective assigned to the case, So Jun-hyuk, flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. His reputation was one of neutrality, a man who had survived in a system that punished those who asked too many questions. But even he couldn't ignore what was in front of him. Names, transactions, details of meetings that had determined the fate of entire companies and entire families. The network of corruption was deeper than they had realized. Government officials, law enforcement, and executives, all connected by numbers that had been carefully hidden for decades. Yang sat on the other side of the glass, his posture relaxed, his face betraying nothing. He did not ask for a lawyer. He did not protest. His silence was not an admission of guilt, but a challenge. The statement would not be enough. Even with the ledger, the system had been built to protect men like him. Outside, the media frenzy grew louder. Reporters shouted questions, their voices rising with anticipation. A scandal like this could shake the city, but only if the truth made it out before it was buried. Jiho and Haiwan knew what was coming next. There would be pressure. Deals offered in hushed voices, warnings disguised as advice. The people exposed in the ledger would not stand by and wait for their names to be dragged through the headlines. Zhang was just one piece of a larger structure. Even without him, the foundation would not crumble easily. And then, just as expected, the calls began. The first was from an unknown number. The second came from someone they once thought of as an ally. The third was not a call but a message delivered through the sudden disappearance of one of the key witnesses. The system was fighting back. Jiho tightened his jaw as the news came in. The officer who had been tasked with transporting Choi Sang-min to a safe location had been found unconscious. The car was missing. Sang-min was gone. Haiwan closed her eyes, her fingers pressing into the ledger as she exhaled. It had only been a matter of time. They had pushed too close to the truth. Now it was pushing back. The rain had started falling by the time they left the station. The streets glowed with the reflection of headlights, the air heavy with the scent of wet asphalt. Jiho gripped the steering wheel, his expression set in quiet determination as he navigated through the maze of roads leading away from the city center. Haiwan sat beside him, her gaze unfocused. The exhaustion had settled in, but sleep was not an option. Sang-min had known the risk. He had been ready for this. But that did not make his disappearance any less urgent. They retraced their steps, moving through contacts who owed them favors, following trails that led to empty rooms and dead phones. The people who had helped them before were suddenly unreachable. Zhang's arrest had sent ripples through the city. But instead of fear, it had awakened something else: loyalty, self-preservation, the quiet understanding that power did not disappear overnight. Jiho's fingers tapped against the steering wheel as they pulled into a quiet lot near the docks. The city stretched behind them, its skyline a stark contrast against the dark water. There was one last place to check, a warehouse Sang-min had mentioned before, a place he had used when he first went into hiding. The moment they stepped inside, the air shifted. The space was too quiet. No signs of movement, no struggle, but something had been left behind. A phone. Not Sang-min's, but close enough. A burner, the kind used for a single purpose before being discarded. Haiwan's heart pounded as she picked it up, pressing the power button. One unread message, coordinates. Jiho leaned over, his eyes scanning the screen. The numbers marked a location just outside the city, near an industrial complex long abandoned. A meeting point, or a trap. Either way, they had no choice but to go. The roads leading to the complex were empty, lined with warehouses that had long since stopped operating. The silence stretched, broken only by the occasional hum of passing cars on a distant highway. Jiho cut the engine a short distance away. They moved carefully, keeping to the shadows, the weight of uncertainty pressing against every step. A single car sat parked near the edge of the lot. The headlights were off, the windows were dark, and then the sound of a door creaking open. A figure stepped out, moving slowly, deliberately. Sang-min, his hands were bound, his face was bruised, but he was alive, and behind him, standing in the dim light of a flickering street lamp, was the reason why. Not a group of enforcers, not an unknown enemy. But someone they knew, someone who had stood with them before. So-jun Hyuk, the detective, the man who had read through the ledger, who had promised to handle the case, who had stood in the middle of the chaos and let them believe he was on their side. Jiho's breath was steady, controlled, even as his mind raced through the possibilities. Jun Hyuk had been part of the system all along. Not an enforcer, not a puppet. Something worse. A man who had built a career on trust, on the appearance of fairness. A man who had waited, knowing that sooner or later someone would try to uncover the truth. And now, standing there with that same unreadable expression, he held the final move. Sangmin was alive, but only as long as they cooperated. The ledger was in their possession, but only until someone stronger took it away. Power had shifted, but not in the way they had hoped. The city was still holding its breath, waiting for the truth to be revealed. But the truth was only as strong as those willing to fight for it. And at that moment, Jiho and Haiwan knew the fight was far from over. The air inside the warehouse was thick with dust and dampness, the weight of abandonment pressing against the walls. Jiho and Haiwan stood motionless, their bodies rigid as they watched So Jun-hyuk step forward. The flickering street lamp outside cast long shadows across his face, but the calmness in his movements was unmistakable. He had played the long game, moving between loyalty and deception with the ease of someone who had lived in the gray space for years. Sang-min, hands bound and shoulders slumped, barely lifted his head. His face was bruised, the evidence of a fight lingering in the swelling beneath his eye. His breathing was steady but shallow, as if he had learned long ago to conserve his strength in situations like this. He had expected betrayal. Maybe he had even prepared for it. But none of them had expected it from the one man who was supposed to be untouchable. The silence stretched between them, the reality of their situation settling in. Jiho's grip on the ledger tightened, his mind already working through the next move. The ledger was their last piece of leverage, the only thing preventing this from ending right here, in this empty warehouse, where secrets could be buried with ease. If Jun-hyuk had wanted them dead, it would have already happened. But he had chosen this moment to reveal himself. That meant something. That meant he wanted control. Outside, the city continued its restless hum, unaware of the quiet war being waged in the places unseen. The news was still spinning the story of Chairman Jang's arrest, reporters clinging to the sudden shift in power, waiting for the next move. They did not know that the game was still being played, that the pieces were still being arranged. They did not know that Jang had never been the final boss. He had only been a distraction. Jun-hyuk had been moving behind the scenes long before Jang's empire had begun to crack. He had positioned himself perfectly, watching as Jiho and Haiwan worked to unravel the threads of corruption, only to step in at the final moment. He had let them do the hard part. He had let them believe they were winning. And now, he was here to take everything from them. Haiwan's gaze flickered towards Sang-min, searching for any sign of movement, any indication that he had a plan. But his expression remained unreadable. His silence was both a warning and an acceptance. He had already understood what was coming. The warehouse creaked as a gust of wind slipped through the cracks in the walls. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed and then faded into the night. The world kept moving, oblivious to the small, quiet war being fought here. Jiho took a slow breath, his heartbeat steady even as his mind raced. If the ledger fell into Jun-hyuk's hands, the truth would never see the light of day. The names, the records, the transactions would all be erased, rewritten, buried under a new layer of deception. They had come too far for that. The tension shifted, unspoken understanding passing between them. Haiwan's posture straightened just slightly, her weight shifting in the smallest way a signal, a warning, a choice. And then, everything happened at once. The moment of stillness shattered as Jiho moved first, his instincts taking over. His body twisted as he threw his weight forward, his grip on the ledger tightening before releasing at the last second, sending it flying toward Haiwan. The motion was unexpected, a calculated risk. She caught it, barely, her fingers closing around the worn leather just as chaos erupted. Sang-min lunged, the bindings around his wrists no longer as tight as they seemed. He had been waiting for this opening, his body coiled with tension, his exhaustion forgotten in the sheer force of survival. Jun-hyuk barely flinched. He had anticipated resistance. He had counted on it. But even he had not accounted for the full weight of desperation, the kind that made people move faster, strike harder, and risk everything. The sound of a struggle filled the warehouse. The shuffle of feet, the sharp exhales of impact, the dull thud of bodies colliding against metal. Haiwan was already moving, the ledger clutched against her chest, her mind focused on one goal: getting out. Junhyuk's men moved to intercept, but they had underestimated her before. They had assumed she was just the one who followed, the one who observed. They had not expected her to be the one who ran first, the one who moved with the kind of certainty that came from knowing there was no other option. Jiho fought with the kind of precision that came from years of discipline. His strikes were clean and controlled, but he knew this wasn't a fight he could win by force. It was about time, about moments stolen in the chaos. Sungmin wasn't trying to overpower, he was trying to outlast. He knew the limits of his body, the sharp edges of his pain, but he also knew that endurance was sometimes the only weapon left. The warehouse doors loomed ahead, slightly open, the cold night air slipping through the gap. Freedom was right there. Then the sharp, unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. Everything stopped.
Jiho stilled, his breath steady but measured. Hee-won froze, her grip on the ledger tightening. Junhyuk's stance remained firm, his expression unreadable, the weight of power now centered entirely on the single movement of his finger. Sangmin's breathing was ragged, his body tense but unmoving. They had fought their way here, pushed against the inevitable, only to be caught in the very cycle they had tried to break.
Junhyuk's eyes were calm and steady, already knowing how this would end, or so he thought. Because outside, just beyond the walls of the warehouse, the world was finally catching up. The sound of tires against gravel, the slam of car doors, the distant murmur of voices cutting through the night. The system had always worked in silence, in the dark. But now, the light was creeping in. The news had spread too fast. The names in the ledger had already begun to circulate in places beyond their reach. Someone, somewhere, had sent the right message to the right people. The web of corruption was too tangled now, too visible. Junhyuk could not bury this, not with the entire city watching. The gun lowered. The fight was over. Junhyuk did not look surprised. He had played this game long enough to know when a move was lost. But his defeat was not an ending. He was not a man who would disappear into the shadows. He would wait. He would adapt. But for now, Jiho and Haiwan had won. The ledger remained intact, its pages filled with the names of those who had shaped the city from behind closed doors. Zhang's empire had already begun to fracture, and with it, the others would fall in time. The city would not change overnight. Corruption was not so easily erased. But this was a beginning, a crack in the foundation of something that had once seemed unbreakable. Jiho exhaled slowly as the night stretched on, the weight of everything settling into his bones. Haiwan stood beside him, the ledger still clutched tightly in her hands. They had survived, but survival was only the first step. The real fight was just beginning. And this time, they would not be fighting alone.